The Gospel of John quotes Ezekiel 37 more directly than any other New Testament passage, and yet not a single character in the Lazarus story mentions it. Not the narrator, not Jesus, not Martha, not the mourners. The words are there, the structure is there, and the silence about it is almost louder than the quotation itself. Ezekiel stands in a valley full of bones, and God asks him a question that sounds like a test: can these bones live? Ezekiel answers with what every person who has ever stood before an impossible situation answers: "O Lord God, you know." That is not a statement of confidence. It is a statement of surrender. In John 11, Jesus stands before the tomb of a man who has been dead 4 days, and Martha meets him with nearly the same words: "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." She is not saying she believes Lazarus will walk out of the tomb. She is saying she believes Jesus is somehow connected to a power she does not understand. Then Jesus asks her a question that parallels God's question to Ezekiel: "Do you believe this?" Her answer is the covenant formula: "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." The parallels are not incidental, and they are not decorative. They are so precise that a first-century audience steeped in the prophets would have caught them immediately. The Valley of Dry Bones is the only resurrection story in the Old Testament that involves a command to a corpse, the binding of the body, and the infusion of breath. Ezekiel prophesies to the bones. Jesus cries out to Lazarus. Ezekiel commands the ruach, the wind, the spirit, the breath to come from the 4 directions. Jesus at the tomb is described with the Greek verb enebrimsado, a word that means he snarled or groaned deeply in his spirit. The same word appears in the Greek translation of Ezekiel 379, when the Lord commands the Spirit to come. The verbal echo is not accidental. John is writing the Ezekiel scene into the 1st century, using the prophet's vocabulary to tell you that what happened in the valley has now happened in Bethany. But here is the problem that the text creates and does not resolve easily. If John wanted his readers to see Jesus as the fulfillment of Ezekiel 37, why did he not say so? He quotes Zechariah explicitly when Jesus enters Jerusalem. He quotes Isaiah when he describes the people's unbelief. He even quotes the Psalms during the crucifixion. But at the moment of the greatest miracle in the gospel, the moment where a corpse is called out of a tomb, there is no citation formula, no "as it is written," no prophet named. The silence is theologically deliberate, and it forces the reader to ask a different question than simply "did this happen?" The question becomes, what is John saying by not saying it? Perhaps the silence is itself the answer. If John had written "this fulfills what was spoken by the prophet Ezekiel," he would have anchored the miracle to the past, making it a completion of an old promise. But John is doing something more radical. He is not showing a prophecy fulfilled, he is showing a prophecy surpassed. Ezekiel's vision happened to a prophet in a trance, a valley somewhere between Babylon and the grave. John's vision happens to a man standing in the heat of a Judean afternoon, with a stone rolled against a tomb that still smells of decay. Ezekiel's bones were a metaphor for a nation. Lazarus is a real corpse, wrapped in linen, stinking after 4 days. Ezekiel commanded the wind to come from the 4 directions. Jesus does not call for wind. He calls a name. And that difference between a command to the atmosphere and a command to a personas, the difference between a prophecy and its fulfillment. The silence is not a gap. It is a sign that the prophecy has been absorbed into something greater. To understand why, you have to feel what Ezekiel 37 meant to a 1st century Jew. The Valley of Dry Bones was not originally a proof text for individual resurrection. It was a national prophecy. The bones represent the house of Israel, and the promise is that God will bring his people back from exile, remember them, and put his breath in them so they can live as a restored nation. The Pharisees believed in a general resurrection of the righteous at the end of the age, and they used Ezekiel 37 to support that hope. But they did not expect it to happen to one man on a Tuesday afternoon in a village outside Jerusalem. The problem John faces is not that Jesus is fulfilling Ezekiel, it is that Jesus is doing something smaller and bigger at the same time. Smaller because it is one body, not a nation. Bigger because it is not the end of the age, it is the middle of the story. The Hebrew word at the center of Ezekiel 37 is ruach, and it does three things in that chapter. It is the wind that carries Ezekiel to the valley. It is the breath that enters the bones, and it is the Spirit of God that will animate the restored people. When the translators of the Septuagint rendered ruach into Greek, they used pneuma, the same word that John uses throughout his gospel to describe the Spirit that descends on Jesus at his baptism, and that Jesus breathes on his disciples after the resurrection. In John 11, when Jesus sees Mary weeping and the Jews wailing, the text says he was troubled in spirit nebrum sado to pneumati. That is not a gentle grief. That verb appears in the Greek Old Testament only a handful of times, and always in contexts where God or a prophet is confronting evil or death with a kind of holy indignation. In Ezekiel 379, the Septuagint uses the same verb when the Lord commands the Spirit to come. Thus says the Lord God, come from the four winds, O Spirit, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live. The link is unmistakable. Jesus is not weeping because he is sad. He is snorting like a warhorse who smells battle. The Spirit inside him is the same ruach that Ezekiel commanded into the bones, and it is about to demonstrate something that the prophets only foreshadowed. You are standing in your own valley. Maybe it is a relationship that died slowly, a hope that dried up, a faith that feels like dust. You have been telling yourself that resurrection is a doctrine, a future event, a thing you believe in but do not experience. But the silence in John 11 is a revelation about what kind of resurrection is actually happening. If Jesus had quoted Ezekiel, you might have thought the old prophecy is finally coming true. Instead, John leaves the quotation unsaid, so that you have to feel the weight of what is happening without the comfort of a footnote. Ezekiel 37 was written for an exiled people who could not imagine God rebuilding them. John 11 was written for a church that needed to know that the power that raised the nation was already present in the man who stood at the tomb. The silence about Ezekiel is not an oversight. It is the sign that the prophecy is no longer a future promise, it is a present reality happening in front of them. The bones are not waiting for the end of the age. They are waiting for a word from the one who stands before them. But here is the tension that the text will not let you escape. Jesus does not simply call Lazarus out and let him return to life as if nothing happened. There is a detail that most readers miss, a detail that completely reorients the meaning of the miracle. Lazarus comes out of the tomb still bound hand and foot with grave clothes, his face wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus does not say, "Be alive." He says, "Loose him and let him go." That command is not part of the Ezekiel parallel. There is no unbinding in the valley of dry bones. The bones are reconnected, covered with flesh and filled with spirit, but they are never said to be untied. They are simply alive. The binding of Lazarus and the command to loose him suggests that resurrection alone is not the end of the story. Something else is required, something the old prophecy could not address. So why the silence? The answer lies in something John does later in the chapter that changes how we hear Ezekiel 37 forever. And it explains why Jesus himself, standing at the tomb, does not quote the prophet. He does something else entirely. The answer is sitting in the detail that almost everyone reads past. Lazarus comes out of the tomb still wearing his grave clothes, his hands bound, his feet wrapped, his face covered with a cloth. Jesus has called him from death to life, but he has not called him out of the wrappings. The miracle is incomplete at the moment it happens, and that incompleteness is the point. Ezekiel's valley of dry bones ends with the bones standing on their feet, an exceedingly great army, fully formed and fully free. There is no mention of bindings, no command to loose, no second action required. The prophecy concludes with the breath entering and the people standing. But John's version of the same scene has a second command that Ezekiel never gave: loose him and let him go. That command does not come from the prophet's vocabulary. It comes from somewhere else entirely, and it changes everything about how resurrection is supposed to work. This is not an afterthought. It is the theological climax of the entire chapter. John has spent 11 chapters building the case that Jesus is the resurrection and the life, that he has authority over death, that he can call forth the dead with a word. And then, at the moment when that word is spoken and the dead man obeys, Jesus hands the work to the community. He does not unwrap Lazarus himself. He tells the bystanders to do it. The same people who had been weeping, who had been doubting, who had been saying, "Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind have kept this man from dying?" Those same people are now commanded to unbind the man they had buried. The resurrection is Jesus' work. The unbinding is theirs. And this transfer of responsibility is not a footnote. It is the reason John wrote the chapter the way he did. Think about what Jesus could have done. He could have spoken one more word, and the grave clothes would have fallen off like dust. He could have commanded the linen to unwind itself. He could have left Lazarus standing there, free and clean, with no evidence of what had held him. But he did not. He left the wrappings on, and he told the community to remove them. That choice is the most important detail in the story, and it is the one most readers skip because they are already celebrating. They want to see Lazarus walking, not Lazarus wobbling toward the light with strips of death still clinging to his arms. And here the Greek word does the heaviest lifting. The verb Jesus uses is lousate, from luo, which means to loose, to untie, to release from bonds. It is the same word used throughout the New Testament for the loosening of a donkey from its tether, for the breaking of a seal, for the dissolution of a marriage. But it also carries a deeper resonance in the Septuagint. In Psalm 11,616, the psalmist says, "You have loosed my bonds," the same verb, used for God releasing the worshiper from the cords of death. In Isaiah 586, the prophet calls for the loosing of the bonds of injustice, the untying of the yoke. The word carries both the physical and the spiritual, the literal and the metaphorical. Jesus is not just telling them to remove linen strips. He is telling them to participate in the work of liberation that resurrection begins but does not finish. The grave clothes are the evidence of death's hold, and they must be stripped away by human hands. And the word itself echoes forward to John 20, where Peter enters the empty tomb and sees the linen cloths lying there, the same word, athonia, and the face cloth folded separately. The unbinding that began at Lazarus' tomb is completed at Jesus' own resurrection. The community that loosed Lazarus became the community that would later testify that the grave clothes of the Messiah had been left behind. Do you see what this means for you? You have been waiting for God to do everything. You have been sitting in your valley, looking at the dry bones of your own failure, your own grief, your own paralysis, and you have been praying for resurrection as if resurrection were the end of the story. But the story does not end with the breath. It ends with the unbinding. And the unbinding is given to the community. The people around you, the ones who mourned with you, the ones who doubted with you, the ones who rolled the stone away, they are the ones who must help remove the grave clothes. You cannot unwrap yourself. Lazarus came out of the tomb still bound. He could not free his own hands. The resurrection gave him life, but it did not give him freedom from the evidence of what he had been through. Someone else had to touch the wrappings that still smelled of death, and that someone else had to be willing to come close enough to smell it. This is where the historical reality of first-century burial practices becomes necessary to feel with your skin, not just your mind. The grave clothes were not a simple shroud. They were strips of linen wound around the body with a mixture of aloe and myrrh, a sticky resin that hardened as it dried. The body was wrapped tightly, layer upon layer, until the form was almost mummified. The face was covered with a separate cloth, the sudarium, folded and placed over the head. This was not a gentle wrapping. It was a binding that would have required cutting or unwinding to remove. Anyone who has ever tried to unstick a bandage that has dried to a wound knows what the bystanders faced. The linen would have been stiff, brittle in some places, glued to the skin by the dried spices. Lazarus did not step out of the tomb looking like a man who had just woken up. He stepped out looking like a corpse that had been unwrapped too soon, still bound, still marked by what had held him. And the smell, Martha had already said it by this time, there is a bad odor, for he has been dead 4 days. The wrappings carried that odor. The community did not just have to touch the linen, they had to breathe the air of the tomb while they worked. And Jesus stood there and told the mourners to touch it, to pull it away, to do the work that death had made necessary. That is not a comfortable command. It is a command that requires people to handle the evidence of death, to get their hands dirty with what remains, to participate in the slow, awkward, sometimes painful process of removing the remnants of what was. And this is exactly what the church has been called to do ever since. not to perform resurrections that belongs to Christ alone, but to unbind the people whom Christ has raised, to step into the tomb of someone who has been given new life, and to help them shed the things that still cling to them from the old life. You know what those things are: the patterns of thinking that death taught you, the defensiveness that became a second skin, the cynicism that hardened around your hope like resin, the shame that wrapped itself around your identity so tightly you cannot tell where the bandage ends and your skin begins. Christ has called you out of the tomb. He has spoken your name and you have heard it, but you are still wearing the wrappings, and the wrappings do not come off by magic. They come off because someone else is willing to pull at the edges, to find the loose thread, to unwind what death wound around you. And you are called to do the same for others. You are called to be the one who kneels beside someone who has been resurrected and says, "Let me help you with that binding." This is why John does not quote Ezekiel, because Ezekiel's vision was complete at the moment of resurrection. The army stood on its feet, and that was the end. But John's gospel knows that resurrection is not the end. It is the beginning of a process that requires human hands, human community, human patience. The Valley of Dry Bones was a national prophecy about restoration from exile. It was finished when the bones stood. But Lazarus' story is about the church, about what happens after the stone is rolled away, about the slow, daily work of loosening the bonds that still hold the people who have been raised. Jesus does not quote Ezekiel because he is not repeating Ezekiel. He is surpassing him. Ezekiel's prophecy ended with the bones alive. John's gospel shows us that the bones must also be unbound, and that unbinding is not a one-time event, not a single command, not a miracle that happens in an instant. It is the work of a community that has been given the authority to loose what death has bound. Jesus gives that authority to the bystanders at the tomb, and he gives it to every person who has ever stood beside someone who has been raised and wondered what to do next. The heaviest thing this passage produces is this: you cannot raise the dead. Only Christ can do that. But if Christ has raised someone you love, if Christ has raised you, then the work that remains is yours. The grave clothes must be removed. The bindings must be pulled away. The face cloth must be folded and set aside. And the only way that happens is if someone is willing to touch the evidence of death, to lean into the awkward intimacy of unbinding another person, to stay in the tomb long after the miracle has happened. Ezekiel never saw that. The prophets never said that. It is the silence in John 11 that speaks loudest of all.